Welcome to the post game. I'm Michael Brooks, joined, of course, by the great crew that make it all possible. Each and every one of you, welcome new patrons in a little bit. Daniel Bessner is going to be joining us for one of his post game segments where we're going to be talking about pop culture, Hollywood, video games, and police and Pentagon propaganda. I pulled a great clip that the great Anna Kasparian used and commented on in her commentary this past Saturday for the Jacobin Show, Weekends with Anna and Michael, which if you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe to it. We're doing a great show, and I'm really excited about it. Shama Sawant, Torrey Reed, Big Waz, and John Nichols, last four guests. But first, we have about another good chunk of this Noam Chomsky interview, so we're going to play that, and then we'll come back and finish out the rest of the post game. Here is the ongoing interview with Noam Chomsky.
I just really want to ask you about the election, Professor Chomsky. Could you take a couple of extra minutes? And because I think what you're saying is extremely important. And sometimes in the popular conversation, things unfortunately get a bit, I don't know what the right way to frame it is. But if we have an understanding that America is deeply corrupt, has profound institutional problems, that the structure of capitalism produces all of these outcomes, in contrast with, say, a kind of mainstream Democratic Party MSNBC narrative that sort of says, hey, Trump created all of the problems under the sun and everything else. Now, this is something that particularly younger people and definitely people in this audience are going to be very familiar with, this critique and this understanding, and it's a correct one. But I also fear, and I really appreciate that you just highlighted that, and I'm wondering if you could just take a few extra minutes to explain that even as that is true structurally, that what Donald Trump is doing institutionally actually is unique and does matter on its own terms, quite apart from the sort of evasions of the Democratic Party and the kind of mainstream liberal establishment.
Well, Trump is actually, this sounds strong, but it's true. He is the worst criminal in human history. Undeniably. There has never been a figure in political history who was dedicated with passion to destroying the prospects for organized human life on Earth in the near future. That is not an exaggeration. People are focused now on the protests, on the pandemic. They're bad enough. The pandemic is serious enough. We will emerge from it at terrible cost. The cost is greatly amplified by the gangster in the White House who's killed tens of thousands of Americans. So it'll be making this the worst place in the world in response to it. But we will emerge. We're not going to emerge from another crime that Trump is committing: the heating of the globe, global heating. Global roasting, which it's coming to. We're not going to emerge from that. It's a very serious business. The Arctic ice sheets are melting. They're not going to recover. That leads to an exponential increase in global warming. Antarctic glaciers are melting, could flood the world. Recent studies indicate that on the present course, in about 50 years, much of the habitable part of the world will be unlivable. People won't be able to live in South Asia, and parts of the Middle East, and parts of the United States. Sea level, we're approaching a point of 125,000 years ago, when sea levels were about 25 feet higher than they are now. I think it's worse than that. A recent study by one of the top climate scientists concluded that the Scripps Oceanographic Institute, which monitors particles in the universe, CO2 particles in the atmosphere, they're the main monitor, just came out with a study showing that, of course, there's steady increase and escalating increase. And they estimated that we're coming ominously close to a point 3 million years ago when sea levels were 50 to 80 feet higher than they are today. Now, all around the world, countries are trying to do something about it. Some pretty much, some not enough, but at least something. There's one country which is led by a president who wants to escalate the crisis, to race toward the abyss, to maximize the use of fossil fuels, including the most dangerous of them, and to dismantle the regulatory apparatus that limits their impact. There is no crime like this in human history. Okay? Nothing. This is a unique individual. And it's not that he doesn't know what he's doing. Of course he does. So when it comes time to, when his golf course in Ireland is threatened by rising sea levels, he or whoever manages things for him knows enough to petition the government of Ireland to build a seawall because of rising sea levels. It's just he doesn't care. If he can pour more profit into the pockets of his rich constituency tomorrow, and him as well, who cares if the world disappears in a couple of generations? There's been nothing like this in the past. I mean, I should say that as far as the government is concerned, we're seeing something pretty interesting. A parliamentary democracy has been around for 350 years. Started in England in 1689 when so-called Glorious Revolution, when sovereignty was transferred from royalty to the parliament. So beginnings of parliamentary democracy. The United States, about a century later. It's not, the parliamentary democracy is not just based on laws and constitutions. In fact, the British Constitution is maybe a dozen words. It's based on trust and good faith, the assumption that people will act like human beings. So take Richard Nixon, very rotten guy, but when the time came he had to leave office, he left office quietly. Nobody's expecting that with Trump. He doesn't act like a human being. It's off somewhere else. Call it what. So I'll leave it to the psychiatrist to say what it is, but it's plain that it's there. And what he has done is crush the executive offices, practically destroyed. He doesn't even make appointments that can be confirmed by the Senate. Why bother? Let's just make appointments. If I don't like somebody, I'll throw them out. One Republican, Lisa Murkowski, dares to raise a small question about his nobility. Came down on her like a ton of bricks. I'm going to destroy you. I'm going to devote myself to destroying you. It's not fascism. It's what I said before. Tin pot dictator of some small neo-colony where they have coups every couple of years. That's the mentality. We're concerned about vaccines. Okay, there was a chief scientist in charge of vaccine production. He raised some questions about one of Trump's quack medicines. Out. It's the executive branch is nullified. Congress, the Senate, happens to be in the hands of a soulmate of his, Mitch McConnell. In many ways, the real evil genius of this administration, dedicated to destroying democracy long before Trump. When Obama was elected, after a couple of years, Republicans have a Senate majority. McConnell said openly, publicly, my main goal is to ensure that Obama can achieve nothing. Okay? That's saying, I want to destroy parliamentary democracy, which is based, as I said, on good faith and trust and interchange. The Senate is now so-called world's greatest deliberative body. It's reduced to two things: passing legislation that'll enrich the very rich and empower the corporate sector, and massive judicial appointments to stack the judiciary with young, ultra-right, mostly incompetent justices who can ensure for a generation that no matter what the public wants, they'll be able to block it. It's kind of like the Republican effort to suppress the vote, keep people from voting, all the rest. I mean, it's a deep hatred of democracy and fear of democracy. That's not unusual among elites. They don't like democracy for obvious reasons. But this is something special. As I say, 350 years of parliamentary experience are really being put to the test. That's on top of the pandemic, on top of the global warming crisis, the crisis of nuclear weapons, which is equally severe. Trump is dismantling the entire arms control regime, greatly increasing the threat of destruction to us, virtually inviting adversaries to develop weapons that could destroy us, that we can't stop. I mean, but of course, with great euphoria in military industry, they love it, getting huge contracts. What's wrong? I mean, it's a unique position. But you say, as you say, it's not just Trump. It's Trump taking the worst aspects of the capitalist and particularly neoliberal version of capitalism and amplifying them. Now you can see it in, let's just take the pandemic. Why is there a pandemic? In 2003, after the SARS epidemic, which was a coronavirus, it was well understood by scientists, and they were saying another coronavirus, much more serious than this, is very likely. Here are the steps we have to take to prepare for it. Somebody has to take the steps. Well, there is a pharmaceutical industry, extraordinarily wealthy, huge labs. Can't do it. Capitalism. You don't spend money on something that might be important 10 years from now. Stopping a future catastrophe is not profitable. We'll do what we can sell tomorrow. So that's a capitalist crisis. They're out. What about government? They have the resources, they have great labs, but then comes something like called Ronald Reagan, at the beginning of the neoliberal assault on the population. Government is the problem, not the solution, meaning we have to take decisions away from government, which has a serious flaw. It's influenced by people. Now we have to put them in the hands of unaccountable private institutions which have no influence from the public. Then everything will be great. In the United States, that's sometimes called libertarianism. Interesting concept. But just get it out of any public influence, just for the rich and powerful. That's the beginning of the neoliberal assault. And he and Thatcher at the same time. They both knew or else their advisors knew what they were doing. First step, destroy unions. First step for both of them, because they're the main basis for a public response. So if we can get rid of them, you've enhanced the destruction of democracy and the transfer of power to the very few. I don't have to go through the details of what's happened since. But private, the big pharma was out, capitalism, government is out, neoliberalism. Nevertheless, the government could do something. The first Bush, H.W., had established a presidential scientific advisory council board. Obama called it into office practically the first day of his administration, asked them to prepare a pandemic warning reaction system. A couple of weeks later, they came back with a system, was put in place. January 2017, the wrecker comes into office, first days of his administration, dismantle the whole system to respond to the pandemic, started defunding the Center for Disease Control, every health-related aspect of government, year after year, eliminated programs of American scientists in China working with Chinese scientists to identify potential coronavirus threats. Just throw it out. So when it finally hit, the United States was uniquely unprepared, thanks to the record. And then it got worse. He refused to react to it. Other countries responded, some of them very well, very quickly. It's almost gone, largely under control. Not the United States. He didn't care. For months, U.S. intelligence couldn't get to the White House to say there's a serious crisis. And finally, according to reports, he noticed that the stock market was declining. Don't like that, so we have to do something. What he's done since is just chaos with the United States. But again, a large part of the problem is pre-Trump. So why aren't the hospitals ready? Well, they run on a business model. That's neoliberalism. You have to be just-on-time delivery. We don't want to lose a cent. So we don't have an extra hospital bed. We have to make sure that the owners of the CEOs of the private hospitals get millions of dollars a year in compensation. Can't have an extra bed, which we cut into that. So everything's pared to the bone. Nursing homes, which are privately owned, are reduced to minimal functioning because we can make more money that way if we're a private equity corporation that owns them. Now we can contribute to Trump's campaign, so he can have a photo op with us telling us how wonderful you are for destroying the nursing homes and killing all the elderly people. That's what we're living with. So yes, it goes deep into issues well before Trump, but he's a unique phenomenon. Again, the worst criminal in human history. Some of his minor crimes are to destroy American democracy and to create a pandemic, to amplify a pandemic, just killing tens of thousands of people because of him. But those are minor crimes by his standards. We should recognize we're living in a unique moment of human history. Very striking. Everything's coming together. And I'm afraid I have another appointment.
All right. Well, Professor Chomsky, I think you answered the question about voting, as we say, strategically in this election. I think you outlined the reasons there extremely clearly. And I remember President Trump saying when he cut the pandemic office, he said, I don't like to waste money. Anyways, Professor Chomsky, thank you very, very much for doing this. And we wish you all the best and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, folks.
Hey, folks. Proud of that one. Yeah. I will say, I mean, maybe whatever. I think the superlative he used, I actually think I think one of the most interesting things rhetorically about Chomsky is that he's, in a way, so, very much in like the not appealing to like rhetoric or emotion tradition. But then he will actually, quite consciously and absolutely honestly choose to say like, yeah, Donald Trump is the greatest criminal in human history. And I'll explain to you precisely why. I will say, but I don't want to get lost in the particularities of that one frame. I agree with him overall about his analysis of Trump. And I think the ability to synthesize those two positions, essentially, of there's a context for Trump. Trump is not in a vacuum. Obviously, most of the responses to Trump reflect the broader problem. Probably actually more institutionally idealistic than we are, but some of that is just generational, I think. But at the end of the day, his ability to synthesize systems with the unique threat of Trump, I think, is unparalleled and absolutely correct. And I'm really happy that he articulated it on this show. So, and he seemed to be enjoying himself.
Yeah.
I hope so. I hope he was. And I should say next week, I'm actually really excited. We're having William Shaki from Africa is a Country, which is a great leftist website with serious analysis. And he's talking actually about policing persisting after the liberation. So there's so many parallels between apartheid, South Africa, and the United States. And, you know, it remains decades into liberation and ANC governance, enormous levels of police violence and brutality, even including how they've been enforcing the lockdown in South Africa. So we're going to talk about race and class and policing. You cannot ignore the class and capitalist dimension at all. And South Africa is in some respects the horrifying example of this. And then Ronan Burton Shaw is returning, and we're doing a review of the last 10 years. What do we learn from Bernie, Corbyn, Podemos, Syriza, and the strategy for what's next? And then Bill Fletcher Jr. will return for the final show of the month. And then in the first show of July, Stavros from Cumtown. Stavi baby. Daniel Bessner, are you there?
Yes, sir.
Okay, Daniel Bessner is joining us. We were framing this content. It was either going to be like book reading with Bessner. Matt has coined bullshitting with Bessner, which is
I like BSing with Bessner.
BSing with Bessner. Yeah, BSing with Bessner. Bessner and I and Bessner of us have had some great BS sessions. So Daniel, this is going to be it's sort of like, informal history, BSing with Bessner. We're going to talk about a little bit of a lesson of the relationship between Hollywood, the Pentagon, and the militarization of policing. And I actually really want to start by playing this clip. I really strongly recommend everybody watch the full segment that Anna Kasparian did. It's just excellent on our Jacobin show, Weekends with Anna and Michael, which of course everybody should subscribe to and watch in general. But this commentary she did this last week on militarism and policing was just brilliant. And she also dug up this ad that as soon as I saw, I knew I had to play for Bessner. I mean, even regardless of whether we were doing a segment or not, this is just manna of content here for Bessner. And the relationship, I mean, in this video game ad between, police militarization, racism, valorizing the police, and just sort of general American violence. So let's play this clip, and then we'll get to the bigger history to lesson here.
It was glorified, really, in all sorts of propaganda, including in video games. So there's one video game known as Police Quest, and I just want to show you what the commercials look like.
Meet the men and women who risk their lives daily in the most violent city in the nation, LA's SWAT specialists.
We are a life-saving organization, and that's what we do most of the time. We use all of our tactics and all of our training to resolve a situation without hurting anyone. But sometimes there's no way around that, and when that happens, it's a suspect that he decides the way it's going to end.
Learn their tactical maneuvers. Witness their instinct for sensing danger. Follow their daring adventures in Police Quest 5, LAPD SWAT.
And by the way, Jacobin, so many important talks.
So at any rate, yes. And again, I'll just encourage again. I mean, that's just a fantastic commentary that Anna did there. And, she fit that in well as some very great and revealing footage of Daryl Gates, who was involved in the creation of SWAT as the head of LAPD. But Bessner, reaction to that, and then just take us out here, because the relationship between the video game industry, the movie industry, television, and I mean, we know very specifically with regards to the Pentagon, the intelligence agencies, there's literally liaison offices, like that's very strongly established, even bragged about in some respects. But we include also, policing as well. We could really, I think in a kind of loose way, say the entire entertainment and the American national security state apparatus, foreign and domestic.
Yeah, so I think this is something that's been going on for a long time. Of course, very famously, there have been cop radio programs in the 20s and 30s, the cop shows in the 40s and the 50s, and everything like that. So this is not a new relationship between the domestic apparatus of violence and pop culture. But I do think that in the last 20 or 30 years, it's become pretty clear that in a world of different genre forms of television, that the police procedural and the police show has clearly taken off. And it's funny that Anna showed that old ad that must have been from the late 90s of Police
The
Quest.
late 80s, actually.
Oh, are you sure? Because I'm pretty sure Police Quest 4 was like 93.
Okay, no, 93 sounds about right.
Yeah.
Right.
So
yeah.
I remember because one of the first games I played was Police Quest 4, and it was called Daryl F. Gates Presents Police Quest 4, which is actually in the wake of the LA riots, I believe, which Gates was forced to resign soon thereafter, I believe relatively soon. And so he had a real big influence on sort of how people understood policing in the United States because of his influence on pop culture. And so what does this mean? So, of course, as everyone knows, listening to this, after the end of the Cold War, the United States emerged as this great superpower, and it is searching for logic, right? And one of the logics for world governance that it needs to affirm is that it's not a broken society, right? And so there's this enormous tough on crime rhetoric that emerges in the late 1980s and early 1990s with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the rise of the Cold War. And I think, have you seen that documentary, LA 92? It's a National Geographic documentary.
Yeah.
So it starts with George W. Bush's invasion of Kuwait. Using the Gulf War I to repel Saddam Hussein's invasion from Kuwait, and then it juxtaposes that with the Rodney King beating, right? So there's this important moment in American history where decision makers are re-articulating what they want their citizens' relationship to violence to be, in the project of this larger global program to persuade people that the United States is a just society, particularly to people of color, which is why, for example, and then I'll stop talking, what are two of the biggest exports of the 1990s in terms of American pop culture? Michael Jordan and Michael Jackson, right? So there's this turn to American multiculturalism that is this post-Cold War project related to the increasing militarization of American police and the subjugation of domestic dissent. So it's all interrelated.
No, and how does this relate then to, like, it's just like basically, even I think actually Thaddeus Russell made this point to me, that he was saying, like, even relative to the 80s, which we think of as like this incredibly revanchist reactionary time, and it was. I mean, Ronald Reagan literally announces his candidacy talking about states' rights in Philadelphia, Mississippi, as Noam Chomsky pointed out, where the only national profile it had was literally because that's where Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman were murdered going and doing civil rights work. But even then, and you can check this out, just going through kind of, basic pop culture rabbit hole, like, yeah, it wasn't like there was a lot of pop products where, like the whole police department was rotten, or, the entire Pentagon was bad. But even then, as Thad pointed out, there was a lot more willingness, it seemed like, for like, okay, yes, but there is like this group of generals that's really evil, or, or even just in the 70s. I mean, this is actually one of the great movies ever made. I mean, Serpico was made into a movie, and that is true, that like his whistleblowing revealed something. I think literally half of the NYPD, if not more, being involved in everything from violence, brutality, to like systemic corruption. We don't really see that at all. I mean, I'm thinking even like in 2007, Iron Man sort of critiques private military contractors while disaggregating that from the Pentagon entirely, as if like the Pentagon is just this noble, I mean, maybe not that observant thing, because these evil arms contractors are hustling it, but still, that's completely out of the equation in terms of the systemic police or Pentagon critique. Last thing I'll say, real quick, I was watching the other day. I watched a little bit of 21 Jump Street remake with God, I'm completely spacing their names.
Jonah Hill and Channing Tatum.
Exactly. And I mean, there's stuff in the first 20 minutes of like, you know, they're at a park and they're bored with their profile. So they're like, you know, they're like threatening to kill people. They're, you know, the fact that they don't read someone's Miranda rights, like, you know, it's actually ruins their case, but it's just played as a joke. This is also like when he's, you know, anyways, you're watching this and you're actually like, if you've, you know, particularly in this moment, but really at any moment, you're aware of like the murders, obviously, that we're talking about. This, you know, petrifying that is just sort of played for a laugh. I mean, it's not satire. It's not like, you know, poking fun at the institution. It's just like, oh, it's funny.
Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting point, and in some sense, the American ideological tapestry is incredibly complex, right? So this country has traditions of both anti-state force, anti-state authority, and pro-state force and pro-state authority, and you could point to, you know, radical traditions going back to Thomas Paine, to Hamilton, and different approaches to the issue of essentially organized state violence in relation to its citizenry. So these ebb and flow over time. And of course, as I'm sure many people already listening know, in material on the ground, basically modern police forces are relics of the post-Civil War era. In the South, to police the freedmen, and in the North, to police essentially labor militancy. So that sort of material reality interacts at various moments with the ideological strands that I'm talking about. So then the real question that I think we need to ask ourselves is what changed in the 90s, in the 2000s, in the 2010s that got rid of that implicit critique. In Serpico, that's the one that I was thinking of. But I think in a lot of movies, like take, for example, The Godfather, one of the bad guys is McCluskey, right, the Irish cop. And so there's a recognition that state authority can be corrupt that is not as relevant today. So I think
it's so funny in the book, in the Godfather book, the cop that defends Michael Corleone from McCluskey, when McCluskey's just being an absolute, just out of control asshole at the hospital when he's trying to pull security off of the Don. In the book, McCluskey's like second in command is defending Michael Corleone. And what's great is that it's not because like he's a good cop, it's because he's like a Corleone cop. So it's just like competing payrolls. Anyway, sorry, go
ahead. No, it's great. And people should read that.
Yeah.
The book is kind of like considered a trash classic, but it's a classic. It's fun to read.
Definitely.
It expands on the movie in a big way. But so what we could trace then, or we could at least identify as a shift from, let's say, 60s, 70s anti-authoritarianism to 80s, 90s, 2000s, and after pro-authoritarianism. So I think this would actually bring us back to the Chomsky conversation when he was talking about like what is unique about Trump, blah blah blah. I think it ultimately has to do with the rise to power and authority of the baby boom generation and the transformation of that generation's politics over time. And I just mean that in a pure, not generational warfare sense, but in a pure material sense. The baby boomers were such an enormous generation that they literally took over massive cultural industries in the 60s and the 70s, and basically remained dominant in those industries from back then until today. So I would say my inclination would be to examine that shift over time. And I would say two things. One, the collapse of any totalitarian challenger made Americans less reticent about state power, because a crucial aspect of Cold War era propaganda and anti-Nazi propaganda, of course, was that they had groups like the Gestapo or the KGB and the Stasi in East Germany. And so I think the sort of getting rid of that threat also inspired more authoritarian politics here. And then also, I think a general valorization of violence and a belief that the United States could control destiny, could control history, which was expressed internationally with sort of the post-war nation-building projects, and was reflected domestically with things like welfare reform and prison reform and things like that, which were essentially social scientific interventions into the the world. And so I think there's a lot to link these things, and we'd have to locate the change at the level of sort of the actors themselves.
last week on the Majority Report, I interviewed Alexandria Neeson, who has a good piece of Columbia Journalism Review, where she talks about just the relationship between, police and the press, and how, and also obviously how that's, racialized, and the authority dynamics, and how, as an example, like when Laquan McDonald was murdered in Chicago in 2015, that basically, the police put out just a completely false narrative that he was attacking, that he had he was doing no such thing. He was actually retreating when that officer, whose name I'm forgetting, who thankfully, it was actually, in that case, my God, actually charged, but of course only charged after a lawyer basically unsealed the videotape, and the city, which had been covering up this murder, was forced to reveal the truth. And, she connected it to this very potent history of the relationship between the press and uncritically accepting police narratives. And so, there's many directions to take this. And I think it's another conversation for us to be interesting parallels between, cut the Pentagon, cut the police, the parallels there. Bernie Sanders has actually put forward a great piece of legislation of just a 10% Pentagon cut that would immediately get redirected. Another great example of just very solid, real reform, not the end goal, but also something that, no one else is really going to put on the table. But specifically in the context of this conversation, what would you say, even just like legislatively, or I don't know, in terms of exposing for the, in the broader public conversation, what can be done about these relationships between policing, the Pentagon, and culture industries?
Yeah, I think a lot of it could actually come. The problem is it would have to be mostly through executive action, given the president's unique role as commander-in-chief of the military. If a sympathetic president, an anti-militarist president was elected, that person would be able to do things like direct the military not to consult with various movie companies or video game companies. Congress could theoretically do things like make it illegal for someone who worked in the Pentagon or worked in some defense-related industry or security-related industry to consult for a number of years after they were left their jobs, or even to make it totally legal. That's possible. I don't think it would happen. And so basically, I do think it would have to be executive action. And it would have to be essentially the executive directing the military what to do as commander-in-chief. And I think that would probably be a good thing. I think a major issue would be the fact that the rise of the mercenary industry complicates everything, because nominally private contractors could essentially do what they want. Right. And if I had to guess, it's probably mostly at this point people who are private contractors / consultants doing a lot of that consulting. So you'd have to really consider how to classify private contractors and other groups like that who kind of stand in a gray zone of law, and, purposefully for capitalist interests, essentially.
Absolutely. Well, Daniel Bessner, actually, Daniel, that wraps that segment, but can you do one or two more segments with us? You got
Sure.
You got a little more time? All right.
Yep.
Because I want to do, particularly, I want to do clip number 2, this piece from Tony Blair, the former British Prime Minister, of course, who people don't know this, but Daniel Bessner and I deeply admire Tony Blair.
You're a big Tony Blair.
Yeah, we're big Tony Blair fans. We're just trying to live the Tony Blair life. But no, this guy is. I actually, again, he's to me, he is a fascinating figure, and obviously, a grotesque figure and sinister and so on. But actually, maybe you can weave in why he is a fascinating figure. He is actually this kind of ongoing living reality of the 90s in so many ways. But this clip on him basically trying to push forward, and this is something that even in his own government, there was national ID that he was pushing forward aggressively when he was prime minister. The UK, I believe, actually has more surveillance cameras per capita than any other place on the planet.
They got started early in the 90s, I believe, very early.
Right. And accelerated, I think, or maybe even just started in the late 90s under New Labour. But the next phase, one of the things that's so disturbing about Corona is that we're on one hand, in the United States, we're, sitting in the reality that we have an administration that's going to let, tens of thousands of people die, a complete decimation of public health infrastructure and everything else. Then there's this conversation, though, that's also going to be about basically like the next wave of biopolitics. And I wanted to play this clip of Tony Blair talking about digital IDs and Corona, and then get your thoughts on it, because I think this really can't be situated in a kind of a Chila Bimbe, a Gambin conversation. And more prosaically, there's huge money to be made here. This is Tony Blair talking about digital ID.
Create a digital ID today that is much more easily protected, so you can deal with a lot of the privacy and surveillance issues that worry people. But it's a natural evolution of the way that we're going to use technology in any event to transact daily life. And this COVID crisis gives an additional reason for doing that. Because, look, I could be wrong about this, but when I look at, for example, how you restart some businesses, how you restart international travel, I think people's disease status, for example, have they been tested? What is the result of that test? Have they had the disease? Do they have the disease? I think unless you're able to record some of this data in a way that people can use, it's going to be difficult to go back to anything like a near normal in things like transport. So if you're going to start international travel again, how do you do that unless people can be easily tested and have some record of that test?
Danny, thoughts?
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
So I was going to say, when you were talking about Blair, that I always consider him and Clinton to really be a duo, and that Clinton represents sort of the meritocratic, charming side of neoliberalism, and Blair is really like the technocrat. And so that little soliloquy was so interesting. He gets like turned on when he starts talking about his eyes light up, talking about like managing people and tracking people, and he's just the apotheosis, the apex of a certain form of liberal technocracy that took off in the early 20th century, and with the dreams of Frederick Winslow Taylor to essentially directly manage the minutia of everyone's lives. And I think Blair, what excites him is the fact that he's the ultimate 20th century manager, and that he truly believes in things like technology and social science to discreetly track human behavior. And it was just that whole discussion just evinced that to a T, that he's so happy that the individual will be able to finally track and monitor everyone. It's funny that you mentioned Achille Mbembe and everyone, because this really brings us back to Foucault, right? And the sort of Foucauldian dream, or Foucault argues that one of the defining features of modernity is the idea that everyone could at once be totally tracked and not know if they're being tracked, and therefore be totally tracked. And this is exactly the realization of that dream through technology. So I think it's very interesting to examine it. It's a real element of modern liberalism, a really important one.
Yeah, and an enormous, I mean, this is the next area too, like of primitive accumulation, basically, of a basic accumulation. You can, there's the artificial scarcity of basically creating markets, just fake markets through technology. Like a technology could be unlocked, could be open source, but instead we'll do the most regimented IP programs on it and turn it into something that you can essentially rent, the kind of like the feudal Silicon Valley model. And then there is the last remnants in the ecological crisis of basically bioprospecting places like the Amazon for pharma and things like that. And then there is the interior. I mean, the like internal bio of the body. And I want people to actually, especially also though, because if you don't have this either innate deep concern about civil liberties from both public and private institutions, which you should, or you don't have the kind of intellectual infrastructure, it sounds totally commonsensical. Like, of course we need to track and see, like we're in the middle of a pandemic, right? And because I know that that's also going to come across in that as well.
So, do you know the phrase "knowledge is power"? That doesn't actually mean, people misuse it. They say it means like education means like you'll get powerful in society, but it actually referred to the idea that literally taxonomizing and designating something that is knowledge of something gives one power over it. And so, I think it's important to think of this as part of that process by literally identifying something as a problem. For example, not having a particular thing in you, you're essentially disciplining it. And I think that's exactly right. And what's the disciplinary nature of this is I think you're right, primitive accumulation, related to sort of Marxist processes of capital accumulation by essentially identifying things to be bought and sold, right? Because things can't be bought or sold or work on a market unless they're identified. So I think this is where you could see how Foucauldian and Marxian insights come together very nicely, in that they to get a little academic about it, they very much complement each other in understanding how the present society governs itself, and it works in everything. And then I'll stop. But it works in everything. For example, like ankle monitors, right? You have to buy the ankle monitor which people violate, which then gives more capital to the state, which then impoverishes a certain class in the cycle. So I just think this is a general tendency that is important to take cognizance of.
I think that like we are really in a very important political moment too when it comes to privacy and those individual rights. And it's so frustrating because of the way that it's played out specifically in the United States, where like wearing a mask has become such like a cultural signifier, right? It's like the people who believe in science versus like the loony right wingers. But I think like Amberly Frost's essay in Damage magazine a couple weeks ago on wearing the mask and sort of resisting the idea of it, saying like, yes, I wear the mask because I understand the role that it plays, but resisting this other kind of like liberal like embrace, right, of like accepting all of these restrictions and tattling on your neighbors. Like there's a very frightening aspect to all of this, and it's like we should understand this as like a sacrifice that we're doing collectively, and not like an embrace or like some kind of symbol of basically being people who are prepared to accept and obey whatever is given to them by the state and by authorities. And you see, like, the worst aspect of this would be this kind of Tony Blair fantasy of basically being able to track everybody across the world. I mean, he's talking.
Unfortunately, it's not much of a fantasy.
No, I mean, but he's talking about too, like a supranational level kind of as well.
Well, this would be privately done.
Yeah,
I would be shocked if Tony Blair doesn't, sit on a board or isn't involved. He's got extensive post prime ministerial portfolio of this stuff. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I think, just like on a kind of like philosophical, political level, the struggle that we've seen with the movement for Black Lives and these protests over the past couple of weeks is something that's very important, that people are actually saying, we understand that going out into public does come with the risk of potentially like spreading the virus, but we are actually making a political choice right now that standing up for these rights supersedes that. And I think that's actually is like something that's been very encouraging on a political level, that people are willing to make those distinctions, because there was a real moment when this first started that I was feeling a lot of pessimism of like, this creating a scenario that is perfect for like hyper like technocratic neoliberalism to take control. Everyone's staying in your place. You're consuming primarily virtually. The public is completely dissipated, and you get maybe food delivered a couple times a week, all while like this massive underclass is like exposing themselves to the virus, like in the shadows. There is a real development of a very frightening future that still is ongoing. But
that's still, and I love what you're saying, David. And I just want to add another quick point to this for you guys to riff off of, because I think this is another one of these conversations where it's like, there really is, I don't know what terminology you want to use, but I do think if you have the worldview that we have, whatever, anti-essentialist, Marxist oriented, whatever, it really reveals just the lunacy of so many of these debates, like the mask, right? Like the right-wing thing is, it's a conspiracy theory, dad, don't tell me what to do, fuck, or it's just pure horrific narcissism. Mm-hmm. And then on the other hand, the liberal answer is like, not, well, of course we're going to do this right now, but as you say, we're going to deeply question and resist the overall tendency. We're not going to just say like, oh, well, sure, Tony Blair wants us to have, digital ID now. and then, and I think Benjamin Studebaker had a really smart piece about this too, that like even the mask thing, like, again, and it's annoying how much we have to say it, but, like in Amber's piece, it was a great piece. And she said, wear the mask. But, the fact that government isn't providing the masks, let alone hospital beds and everything else, is the structural problem here. And that like culture war skirmish is not where the ultimate action is. The ultimate action is in the lack of health infrastructure. And I think like even, and the last point really quick, like there were people that, all of a sudden like medical and other authorities came out and said, well, actually all of a sudden it's totally fine to break quarantine because this is a serious issue. And like the truth of the matter is actually more deep and more challenging than what you're saying, Griscom, which is like, of course it's not safe that we've been out protesting. Yeah. And of course, by the pandemic logic, you shouldn't be breaking the lockdown. But in fact, police murder and terrorism of Black and brown and poor and working communities is superseding that. Mm-hmm. And people have made that democratic choice. And that is infinitely more important and correct. It is the right choice, in my opinion, and not something that can actually be reverse engineered to be justified in a technocratic way, because it isn't technocratic. It's a democratic uprising, even in the context of the objective reality and risk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a political choice, essentially,
right.
Is what you're saying.
Right.
And oftentimes different value fields come in conflict: politics, technocracy, health, even. And it has to, one has to make a choice. And what really frustrated me, I don't know if you saw this, guys, but there was a lot of discussion in right-wing media. It's like, how could all these public health officials support the protests and not support, people going to ransacking Walmart for consumption purposes, right? And it just highlighted to me the total poverty of American political discourse, where everyone's talking about categories, right? The category of leaving and massing and taking no cognizance of the different political values. And I think that's important, because I think it relates to that nonsense over James Bennett, is that what we're seeing now is a transformation in how people understand the news, where the idea that there was a view from nowhere is coming under increasing question. I think largely because the post-World War II consensus in terms of politics, geopolitics, economics is itself coming under question. We're seeing a big transformation in how people understand the basic profession of providing information to what we call the public. And that's also a really interesting question that I think relates to a lot of these larger processes that you, David, and Michael just identified.
That's great. Can you do one more?
Sure.
I gotta run. All right, let's do. I want to do. And actually, wait. Is Matt saying he can't be on screen when it's the four of us? Is that what the deal is?
Yeah, the logo's covering the bottom right a little bit. So.
Oh, damn it. All right. We'll do this. We'll do one more, and then we need our Matt back. But I wanted to talk about this. I wanted to get Daniel on this as well. Let's do this incredible story from Mexico that Bloomberg's reporting, that AMLO has indicated that he's willing to help Venezuela with fuel subsidies. I'll quote briefly here. Mexican President Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, just scroll down a bit. Thank you. Said Monday that he's willing to sell gasoline to Venezuela as a humanitarian gesture despite U.S. sanctions against the South American country. If they requested it and it was a humanitarian necessity, we would do it, Lopez Obrador said, replied to a question, adding that Venezuela hasn't asked Mexico for aid at the moment. No one has the right to oppress others. Venezuela is facing crippling gasoline shortages after years of mismanagement of production and refining infrastructure. That is a very interesting way of leading off that explanation.
Yeah, that's
not to say that the Venezuelan government has not made mistakes, but the most crippling, maybe outside of Iran, arguably the most crippling sanctions regime in the world, from the world's preeminent superpower, and endless, seemingly almost week by week attempts at coups and other violent interference may have something to deal with it. I just want you guys' thoughts. I'll start with you, Danny, and just also, in the context of, I see it very clearly in, in the centrist media, all of a sudden there's these ludicrous comparisons between Bolsonaro and AMLO. Again, it's not, whatever. AMLO is like any other political leader, not perfect, but I think, especially, we don't even, we could just talk about the coup in Bolivia. Anytime you start getting into this maximalist, moralistic discourse about a leader in South America who's doing something for poor people, doing something for working people, and now continually showing that he's willing to subvert U.S. aggression, I think we got to be very careful of the propaganda you're going to see against him.
Yeah, it's nice to hear. Of course, as people listening probably know, there's centuries-long tradition going back to the founding of the independent republics in the early 19th century of trans-Latin American solidarity, right? And so this is, again, a trend that rises and falls over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, reaching a height in the rise of the non-aligned movement in the 50s and the 60s, and the rise of the new international economic order and the new world information order. And of course, the pink tide, there were discussions about trans-Latin American solidarity. So I think it's what it seems like is AMLO, if I had to guess, is given his own personal history, sort of reaching back into that really nice internationalist, transnational Latin American tradition, where essentially the countries of the continent have, and Central and South America have, and the Caribbean too, have come together to attempt to form a power bloc against essentially the United States. That's succeeded and failed to a greater or lesser degree at various moments, but it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world if AMLO was serious behind this and made the important statement, particularly within the Western Hemisphere itself, that one could defy the United States and begin trading with Venezuela. I think, as with most sanctions, it's ordinary Venezuelans, just like ordinary Iranians, are the ones who are getting hurt. And so it'd be nice if AMLO, keeps this rhetoric up and puts some real muscle behind it.
I would just add that, it's been pretty amazing to see the concern with which, writers at the Financial Times and Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg have paid to the poor in Mexico over the past couple of weeks. And then you start to see, the reality of how the media pressure plays its role. When you recognize that, people are pissed at AMLO because he's not willing to put the country further into debt, to international creditors. And I'm not even trying to make a prescription necessarily about what AMLO needs to do specifically with the coronavirus case, but just sort of trying to understand it from the United States financial community, why they're so pissed. As we're watching Argentina right now struggle for the right to be able to practice democracy within their own nation, basically harass AMLO over his, financial plans with the international finance community. And two, I think you're absolutely right to highlight this and how brave it is for AMLO to stand with Venezuela at a time when that is obviously not the easiest thing to do. It would be exceptional even without the coronavirus pandemic going on in the background, but especially so with it.
Absolutely. Daniel Bessner, thanks a million, brother. Appreciate your time. Stay safe, stay strong. Talk to you soon.
See you around.
Bye, guys.
See you around.
See you, Daniel.
Matt, could we take a question or two from the Discord? And David, did we get something from Al Jazeera on?
Yeah, we have that.
Okay, great.
Okay, yeah.
And then we'll take one or two questions and then get to a few more stories and then we'll wrap.
Okay. TMBS questions. Here we go. This is from Jim Jimster. If it doesn't come up from Bessner's convo, I should have read this before I started, but anyway, cops and live PD have just been canceled. PD filmed in my area. Talk about propaganda, manufacturing consent. Be interesting to see how Brooklyn 9 comes from that. That's just more of a comment. Here's another one from The Real Nod. How can the current revolutionary mood be leveraged beyond the current demands? Is it really only about police reform? And so can't it be about much more? We should be worried about co-opting purposes. I'd say we made it pretty.
Sorry.
Am I cutting out? Sorry.
A little bit. Go ahead, Matt.
I was just going to say, I think it is being made about more than police reform. And then like the 8 Can't Wait campaign got a lot of blowback.
Yes.
Because it was just about reform. I think actually there's some good indications on there, but of course co-option is being attempted. And there's meetings happening about it right now, I'm sure.
I mean, I think that's the reality. I've just been amazed watching this with my experience watching movements in the United States just in my lifetime, how focused it's been. Just like how many people have tried to co-opt it and just take away the energy from this movement and the fact that it continues to push forward. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't still be suspicious and trying to analyze and make sure that doesn't happen, that it gets co-opted. But this movement really, I feel like they're not going to be able to put this away. As we've mentioned many times on the show, it's like the demands just keep on getting stronger and larger as we go forward.
I want to plug one other thing, a commentary I actually also did for the Jacobin show called "We Can't Let." I think it's titled something like "We Can't Let the Protests Turn into HR Politics." Mm-hmm. So I think there's there's a couple of different tiers to it, and also I'd really recommend, if you haven't seen it yet, definitely watch the bonus conversation, which we've unlocked, the conversation I had with Cedric Johnson. Cedric's like really indispensable scholar, in my opinion, and a great conversation. So I think there's kind of like a couple of different tiers. Like one is, to be honest, like I said before, like I think the way the Democratic leadership is trying to co-opt, minimize, and cynically exploit what people are risking their lives for is obviously disgusting. And then at the same time, like there's actually, if something is properly understood as a narrow reformist civil rights package, that's fine. And as I say a million times, like if I was in Congress, I'd absolutely vote for that. That's like 5% of what's required, but it's something that should be voted on. So and then the next thing is this broader politics of co-optation. And I think it's splitting in two really interesting directions, because I think that the movement itself and a lot of the work coming out around it are, in terms, as David said, the demands have remained really clear and really strong. And then I totally think that, it absolutely is going to lead to, we were saying with Cedric, like, more sort of like essentialist white middle-class metaphysics, which I think is both, I think actually has a lot of serious problems, because it is in fact a middle-class politics, as Vivek Chibber pointed out. And also it's sort of, it's not as, I don't want to exactly equate things like this with really important, literal legislative stuff. But like, as Cedric said in the interview with me, it's like something like there should be training in institutions against things like implicit bias. And there should be and diversity is an incredibly important and positive thing. But when you start all of a sudden noticing the way that something that is very structural and implicates, again, just literal materiality turns into a kind of morality tale, that's always a major red flag. And, again, the shorthand is, I acknowledge my privilege. Can I keep my money? That's a problem. And also, again, I think a lot of the essentialist discourses, and, I don't know if we have time to get into it, but that white fragility book is trash and terrifying and nothing I would encourage, nothing that could ever, people should read about Ronnie Kasrils. I'm going to read an example of a serious material, ruthless anti-racist fighter. It is not going to come from, a new middle-class moral panic and attempt at cleansing and perfection. Those projects are toxic, and they don't lead to serious material redistribution and fulfilling the rights revolution. I think the movement itself, I think the way Andrew Cuomo was like, "You won," and everybody immediately was like, "Fuck you, we're staying on the street." I think it's absolutely beautiful. All right, we've got one more maybe.
Oh, you're muted,
Matt.
What's y'all's favorite? This is from Dave from Jamaica. What's y'all's favorite satirical movie? I've been enjoying the Christopher Guest movies. Rest in peace. What's his name? The guy who just passed away. Fred Willard.
Fred Willard is amazing.
Yeah.
Fred Willard is so fucking funny, man.
All those movies are great.
Those are all great movies. History of White People in America is also really funny with Fred Willard, Martin Short, or Martin Mull, I want to say. But I saw that years ago. But yeah, all those movies are really funny. but specifically satirical. Huh. I don't know.
That's catching me off guard too, I have to say.
Yeah, I think the Christopher Guest movies, Wayne's World 1 and 2, great satirization of the indie music scene. And
you know what? Four Lions by Christopher Morris or Chris Morris. It's crazy. Also, like, there's a lot of those British comedians that have Twitter and kind of ruin them with their lame politics. I think Christopher Morris probably has better politics, but let's just hope he doesn't get on Twitter to prove us wrong.
This is just funny, actually. We'll play. We got, I think, 3 more to get to. This is pretty funny. Look, I'm a big Bill Burr fan. Oh, by the way, if you haven't seen it yet, definitely watch the new Chappelle special. Really, it's available on YouTube. Definitely watch that. And so, I think, I'm a huge Bill Burr fan too. I think he's very funny. I think he's also, again, I always say these are like very good examples of how broader sets of folks are thinking about things. And this kind of like, the way Joe Rogan is going to start to concern troll about the fucking masks here. I mean, again, and we said, like, yes, what Amberly Frost pointed out, that underlying left impulse. We're not going to just say, oh, yeah, digital ID, that's great. But then at the same time, this kind of like just basic right-wing bullshit of, oh, you going to wear a mask? Mm-hmm. I love how Bill Burr answers this. I think this is hilarious. And I went out and popped my mask on and took the walk after I saw this.
You want people to walk down the street with a mask on?
Let's not start this, Joe.
Do you, though?
Let's not start this. Okay.
Let's start it.
I don't want to start this bullshit. I'm not going to sit here with no medical degree, listening to you with no medical degree, with an American flag behind you, smoking a cigar, acting like we know what's up better than the CDC. All I do is I watch the news once every 2 weeks. I'm like, mask or no mask? Still mask? All right, mask. That's all I give a fuck about. I don't care.
But even they say you shouldn't wear a mask unless you're treating a coronavirus patient. The World Health Organization.
Yeah, but they didn't say that initially.
What does that even mean? I don't know what's he referring to there? I definitely think they're still telling you to wear masks.
Well, the thing is like, and look, there's a point to be made that like initially like we were lied to.
Yes.
And they were saying that wearing a mask wasn't important because they were afraid that people were going to buy up all the masks.
Yeah, they lied to us because they didn't have production.
Scandal, and I think we should be, rightfully upset about this. But Joe Rogan is completely off on this one.
Yeah.
Totally. All right, let's keep going.
They didn't say it initially.
No, they didn't.
They did, and then it gradually, and then wait, and then everybody wore the fucking masks. This is like rollerblading. Everybody fucking rollerbladed, and then there was that one fucking homophobic joke, and then everybody acted like they never did it. And then 100 million fucking rollerblades got thrown into the fucking ocean. We all wore masks, and then all of a sudden, people are fucking sitting there. What? You don't have the body type for it, dude. Your fucking knuckles would scrape on the ground, even with that extra 2 inches. I just love how wearing a mask became like this fucking like soft thing that you were doing, like being.
I liked.
That's pretty good.
Just the totally unnecessary shot about rollerblading. Relax. Put on the fucking mask.
Yeah.
Have the deeper concern, of course. It's also something that's so like you get into this like shit about digital ID and national databases and and ankle monitors and how your phones can monitor your heart rate. And there was this whole thing I was reading about years ago about like the is there going to be a regulation between what your cell phone provider can sell your insurer about your second by second biometrics, right? This is serious stuff. There's something honestly so charmingly analog about, hey, you just pop on a fucking mask and look out for your fellow human beings. There's no tag on the mask. There's no biometrics on the mask. It's the simplest thing in the world. It's the same thing people did 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. The last time there was a pandemic like this.
Yeah, it's amazing. You're talking to Bessner earlier about the whole Foucault thing, and he talks about the sort of plague as a forerunner to the panopticon. whereas like you were literally cordoning up the city into neighborhoods, having a specific state watchman there to make sure people would have to come to their windows and show themselves, and if they didn't show themselves, they would assume you were sick, and consequences would follow. And to kind of tie in another ongoing thematic thing is there's these stories, and Defoe talks about this in the Literary Hangover episode I just did, of people going out in the last time in 1721 the plague erupted, going out and killing watchmen because they were abusing people. And he's like, well, they were also people who needed jobs anyway, so they're from the same class. So the aristocracy was like fine with it, basically. But you see the like development of a police state and the sort of dynamics of desperate jobs, and people. A lot of like wealthy people escaped to the suburbs and left their workers in the city to fend for themselves. You're not coming with us, sorry. And I mean, pretty amazing stuff, but good thing we've put all that behind us.
Yeah, exactly. It's so nice that we're at a completely different point in
comparisons to 100 years ago are so frightening.
That's 400 years ago.
Oh, sorry. I thought you were talking about the United States.
Oh, right, yeah.
God, geez. Oh, that's even wilder. I don't know. I've just been reading a lot about, like, in Texas, for example, like the Spanish flu was really devastating in Central Texas because they reopened really quickly. And then there was a massive second wave, I don't know. It's scary to think that this is actually this thing that feels so world historic has happened in like somewhat recent history, and we're still not learning the lessons.
And learn the lessons of, the way the Obama administration fairly well managed Ebola in the United States.
It's like, well, you can learn the lessons, you just can't enact them.
Right. You can do all the learning you want.
You can have a great idea of how you're getting
totally free to read about it.
Honestly, not to go too almost like for me, like the Joe Rogan, like this was like this will be a vivid memory for me. Like right when this first started and we started to realize how serious it was, I remember listening to the Joe Rogan podcast. I can't remember who his guest was, but he's like a disease expert, like talking about how serious coronavirus.
Michael Osterholm, we had him on Majority Report after.
Oh, wow, yeah. And I just remember being like, wow, this is so serious. It is so funny for me to now watch Joe Rogan like 4 months later be like, oh, we shouldn't wear a mask anymore.
No joke. My dad felt like that's the only time he's ever listened to Joe Rogan. He's like, somebody shared me with the Rogan thing, and this guy was actually impressed me about, like, I've been telling him about coronavirus, but it took some other, sharing a Rogan interview with Michael Osterholm.
Matt, I'll be honest. You were telling me about coronavirus, and I was like, I don't know. And then Joe Rogan.
That's awesome. It's like, I don't know, Matt. I'm gonna fucking listen to his show.
I'm not even a Joe Rogan fan. It was just a random.
Anyway, like Joe Rogan was saying the best way to cure elk meat is actually when it's raining outside, but fucking Corona's coming.
Honestly, that's why that Joe Rogan can talk about stuff like that is actually useful to him.
Oh, 100%. I mean, actually, Russell Brand had a really good commentary on Joe Rogan and Spotify and like male spirituality stuff. It's actually, that one's worth watching. All right, do we have this clip? Because I'll set this up if we have the AJ clip.
Yeah.
Okay, so in 1962, India and China fought a war that dealt with a border dispute in the Ladakh region. This is a region that's close to where the Chinese government occupies Tibet. The border has never been fully resolved, and it's a kind of ongoing source of tensions in the Chinese and Indian relationship. And now, of course, is a very different, dynamic. We have, extreme far right, ultra nationalist, consolidating and Indian government. Obviously, I do think, there have been shifts in Chinese foreign policy. They're definitely, the silent rise is over, as it were. And so there is much more assertiveness and aggression in Chinese foreign policy. There's a deep relationship that's developed between China and Pakistan. And just yesterday, it was horrifying. I mean, at least 20 Indian soldiers were killed in a clash in the border with China. The incident follows rising tension between the two Asian superpowers. I don't know if we have any video here.
No, sorry.
Okay, I'll read it. At least 20 soldiers have been killed in a face-off with Chinese forces in the disputed border region, the Indian Army said, in a major escalation of weeks-long standoff in the Western Himalayas. In a statement, the Army said on Tuesday that 17 critically injured Indian troops succumbed to their wounds, in addition to officer and 2 soldiers who had died earlier. You scroll down. Indian and Chinese troops have disengaged in the area where the clashes took place, the statement said, adding that India is firmly committed to protecting territorial integrity and sovereignty of the nation. So look, this is, as much as people are worried about the peninsula and much as people are worried about, North Korea, which obviously has not gone away, this is, according to most analysis, even just the equation between China and Pakistan, this is the most likely area in the world for, an atomic exchange. Mm-hmm. Now you have this dispute that has lasted to some extent for 45 years between China and India that has not been resolved, heating up at a time with 2 governments with a very unlikely posture and desire to back down. And I think it's, it's interesting. And this is just a distinction in governance structure. Like, China, obviously, like any other state in the world, can use foreign conflicts to fortify domestic position. But because, obviously China isn't a democracy and there is a responsiveness to the public around certain things, but not others. China can potentially guide these things more, right? And you see, like, as an example, at certain times, like, it's okay to go protest aggressively at the Japanese embassy. Now we're going to pull back. And if you keep doing it, you might get in trouble. And India, has never been, it's been formally a democracy for decades. It's obviously always been a place that has had everything from the horrifying occupation of Kashmir that, of course, has gotten worse, but has always been, one of the most militarized places on the planet. There's been pogroms against Sikhs. There's, persistent inequities and brutalities in India. But at the same time, Modi is still a leader that's competing in elections and that is consolidating. And I think the relationship between the vicious assault on Muslims inside India and then also an example, an opportunity to chest thump against Pakistan and China is pretty irresistible. I don't know in this case, I don't really know who has more validity in their claims. Yes. I think in the 60s, I would imagine, and certainly my read is that, Nehru was a much more kind of herbivorous leader than Mao, more interested potentially in finding an arrangement, but I don't know validity of that particular territorial claim.
I was just going to add a little bit of context to it, at least like what some people have been, the hypothesis of what led to the conflict is that, and again, yeah, I don't know like the actual, like, I think it's, it's a purely like disputed area. I think it's really difficult to come up with any kind of judgment. And I think it says a lot more about what side you prefer than anything. But specifically what I've read, the Indian nation has been really building up their infrastructure in the area around like areas that are disputed, while the Chinese have like very established roads and systems on their side. So I think this sort of like led, to basically, the dispute basically coming to the forefront was that India has been spending a lot of energy right now, like trying to build infrastructure in the area that's disputed. But it's definitely wild.
Yeah. So we'll keep following that. Do we have one more Discord question or two? And then we got one final piece of sound before we end for the night.
We have all 3 Discord questions.
Okay, great. Well, anyways, let's play this. This is really significant. This is a new video put out for the Fight for 15. And just, we talked about Tyson Foods and the meatpacking industry. Just the rate of exploitation, the absolute lethal abuse of the fast food industry and its workers, and the fact that this organizing has been going on for so many years for just the bare minimum of decency, $15 an hour to work an incredibly hard service job at McDonald's, but obviously it could, be Burger King or Wendy's or whatever, or KFC. This is just extraordinary. And of course, Wendy's, as this McDonald's, as this video points out, is quite willing and quite eager to identify itself with fighting racism as an example. This is a very important new video from the Fight for 15 struggle.
Hi, my name is Terrence Wise, and I'm a McDonald's worker from Kansas City, Missouri. McDonald's just released their second dividend payment of 2020, and in total, the company has spent $2 billion in giveaways to shareholders and Wall Street so far this year. That's $2 billion to line the pockets of wealthy shareholders that should be going to us, the frontline workers, in this pandemic. McDonald's is making a deliberate choice. Since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, McDonald's has failed to protect its workers, particularly workers of color, who are contracting and dying from COVID-19 in disproportionately high numbers. McDonald's chooses to spend billions on their investors. They choose to spend money lobbying the Trump administration against passing sick leave laws for all their workers. And they're paying for ads to say they support Black Lives Matter instead of fighting systemic racism their company perpetuates. Every day, McDonald's chooses to put profits ahead of its workers, us, who make the company run. Every day, McDonald's is making a choice to silence our voices.
We deserve 15 in a union and benefits like
please mute Mr. Wise's phone.
Thank you, and please.
Okay.
McDonald's tells us we're essential workers, but they treat us like dogs. When George Floyd was killed, they came out and said they were one of us. That is very insulting. McDonald's, you are the second largest employer in America, but your actions have spoken louder than words. We need 15 and we need a union, McDonald's. It's time to be a part of the solution and not continue to be part of the problem.
Wow. Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent.
And anytime these companies come out and say that they're with you like that, know that like those stats about how most Americans only have like $400 or less in case of an emergency, all of these companies dine on that. Like that means labor force to them. And I mean, yeah, it's disgusting.
They literally dine on that. These companies are predicated on, I mean, again, not only are they not standing with Black Lives Matter, not standing with anything to do with protecting or respecting essential workers, and forget that word, protecting essential workers. You arguably, I mean, you cannot have specifically a second largest employer that treats its employees that way without a surplus labor population of which the police are there to terrorize. So not only are they not, in terms of the fact that they are union busters and they treat their own employees grotesquely, they are elemental to a whole set of pathologies. I mean, very particularly as a company, they're elemental to, the creation of the suburbs, to all of the ecological crisis and alienation that gets tied up in that. And their whole model is predicated on the systems that he just identified there. And not even to mention the fact, of course, the overall global supply chain and, meat production that they're involved with is, has labor and human rights consequences across the globe, as well as being a major, major contributor to the climate crisis.
I would just add to further the conversations we were having earlier, making that point that they did in the video is that this statement that you're making about Black Lives Matter is ridiculous when you're spending all of your time exploiting your employees, I think is really important. Not only is it important rhetorically, because it really, it's a very strong point, but it's also exactly what we're talking about, not allowing the movement to get co-opted, right? Because it makes it very clear that, like, look, any company that has like a functioning PR department can put out the statement that they're supposed to put out now, right? But what really matters is actually making the serious material change in people's lives and the way that you interact with the world. And I think that we're going to have to continue to be making sure that that point is made, because there's a lot of people that really understand that if they hit a couple keywords, buzzwords, and hashtags, that there's a certain segment of the population will be like, oh, well, great, now they're a progressive company. Meanwhile, they're just exploiting, they're putting a bow on the exploitation that they're practicing. So I think this is a phenomenal ad, and I think this is it's ridiculous too, by the way, that we're still having the fight with McDonald's on this question after so many years and so much exposure about how nasty of a company they are to their employees.
And on the Adolph Reed thread, there are ways in which, McDonald's, in terms of some of the executive leadership team and advertising companies and so on, have done in that neoliberal sense pretty well. Mm-hmm. And that's fine, right? That's, sure. But that again reveals, the three big choices that Adolph Reed outlines. Do you want brutal inequities in capitalism with white supremacy, or do you think it's totally fine to have absolutely brutal, grotesque inequities in capitalism as long as the top 1% of the predator class is proportionally represented across various lines of diversity? Or do you say we need actual democracy and public provision for all, period, full stop? And, that's what that struggle is about. And we support it in any way we can, any way, shape, or form. I think that was a very, very effective video. And I'd really urge all of you who are, using social media to really, definitely amplify content like that as much as possible. And thank you to the great Harvey K for sharing that with me to begin with. I know he was pushing that very strongly because he cares very deeply about, the labor movement. All right, folks. This Sunday, second part of the Pakistan series with These Long Wars, which is just great. And next week, William Shaki, Ronan Burton Shaw, Joanna Viest is going to return to talk. She has this great piece on this very positive new Supreme Court decision on equity, but also the broader struggles on the shop floor and on the street. And she's also going to connect it with her work against biomedical essentialism. I'd go back and listen to the first conversation we had, Beyond Intersectionality, which is available for patrons. We're going to do another two-parter with her. She's brilliant. I'm very much looking forward to that. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, David. Thanks to each and every one of you. Thanks, everybody who makes this possible. Stay strong, stay safe, be well.